Imagine the scent of rain-drenched cedar and ancient rosier-dusted silver. That is the smell of power. That is the smell of the man who owns this province, the man who hasn't seen me in 3 years, and the man who is currently standing 3 inches from the heavy oak door where my 2 greatest secrets are sleeping. This isn't just a reunion, it's a collision. I spent 36 months building a life out of shadows and silence, convinced that a duke with a heart of stone would never look for a runaway governess. I was wrong. The predator didn't just find me, he tracked me. And now the air in this tiny cottage is vibrating with a low primal growl that tells me one thing. The secret is out and the duke is no longer asking. He's claiming. Before we witness the moment the highborn alpha realizes his blood is pulsing in the cradles behind me, hello to my incredible viewers. I'm so happy to have you back. Whether you're listening while commuting through a busy city or tucked under a blanket at home, tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Are you doing okay? If you love stories where the most powerful man in the room loses his mind over the woman he lost, please hit that subscribe button and join our family. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel and you absolutely cannot miss the twist coming in part 3. The floorboards didn't just creak. They screamed under the weight of boots that cost more than my entire village. Evelyn Mercer, first name from the mummy, last from Sicario, pressed her back against the nursery door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her lungs felt tight, the air suddenly sucked out of the room by the sheer physical presence of the man standing in her kitchen. Arthur Sterling, first name from Inception, last from the Covenant, looked like a god of war carved from obsidian. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man whose lineage stretched back to the first kings, and whose temper was whispered to be as volatile as a mountain storm. He stood 6'4" of raw, tailored intimidation, his dark overcoat still glistening with the evening mist. You ran well, Evelyn. Arthur's voice was a low, melodic friction like velvet over gravel. He didn't move toward her yet. He just stood there, his silver-gray eyes tracking the frantic pulse in her neck. 3 years. 6 provinces. I almost admired the dedication it took to vanish from my bed without a single word. I was a governess, Arthur. You were a duke, Evelyn whispered, her fingers clawing at the wood behind her. There was no world where I stayed. You were promised to a crown princess. I was a momentary lapse in your judgment. A lapse. Arthur took a single step. The room seemed to shrink. The scent of him, that intoxicating, lethal mix of sandalwood and cold steel, hit her like a physical blow. It was the scent that had haunted her dreams every night since she fled his estate. I tore down half of the capital looking for my lapse. I broke 3 treaties and bankrupted a traitorous house just to find the man who forged your travel papers. He stopped just a foot away. Evelyn could feel the heat radiating from him, a magnetic pull that made her knees weak. She couldn't let him in. If he saw them, if he saw the silver-gray eyes and the stubborn set of the jaws that mirrored his own, her life would be over. He would take them. A duke's bastards were still a duke's blood, and Arthur Sterling was a man who collected what belonged to him with terrifying efficiency. Go away, Arthur, she gasped, her voice breaking. There is nothing for you here. Arthur's nostrils flared. His head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he did something that made the blood in Evelyn's veins turn to ice. He inhaled. Long, deep. Deliberate. His entire body went rigid. The predatory stillness that had defined him suddenly shifted into something much more dangerous. Something instinctual. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. The scent, he muttered, the words more of a vibration in his chest than a spoken sentence. He leaned down, his face inches from the junction of her neck and shoulder. Milk. Lavender. And... He paused, a low, guttural grumble starting deep in his throat. A sound of pure, possessive recognition that belonged to an apex predator identifying his own. Mine, he growled. The word wasn't an accusation. It was a decree. He didn't wait for her permission. He didn't listen to her protest. His hand, massive and scarred, moved with blinding speed not to strike her, but to wrap around the handle of the door she was guarding. Arthur, please. Evelyn cried, grabbing his forearm, her small hands looking like porcelain against his tanned skin. Don't. Step aside, Evelyn, he said, and for the first time the Duke's voice wasn't cold. It was burning. It was the voice of a man who had just found the piece of his soul he didn't know was missing. or I will take this house off its foundations to get to what is behind this door." The revelation wasn't just in his words. It was in the way the air in the cottage seemed to ignite. Evelyn had kept the twins a secret to protect them from the cold world of the nobility. But as Arthur pushed the door open and the light from the kitchen fell across two small identical cribs, she realized the truth. She hadn't just been found by an ex-lover. She had been tracked by a king who had just smelled his heirs. And in the world of the great alphas, there is no such thing as a secret. Only prey that hasn't been caught yet. The silence that followed the creak of the nursery door was heavier than the 3 years of lies Evelyn had lived. Arthur Sterling didn't storm in. He stilled, his massive frame framed by the doorway, his silhouette casting a long, predatory shadow over the twin wicker cradles. The moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, catching the tufts of dark, unruly hair on the two sleeping infants. Leo and Remy, names Evelyn had chosen from the quiet strength of the grey and the spirited defiance of Ratatouille. Evelyn watched him from the threshold, her breath hitching. Her deepest desire had always been simple: a life where she wasn't a pawn. As the orphaned daughter of a scholar, she had been an invisible fixture in the Duke's sprawling estate, a woman meant to teach his nieces and fade into the wallpaper. But her fear, the one that kept her awake at night, was that her children would be nothing more than illegitimate stains, on a ducal crest, stripped of their mother and raised in a cold, loveless castle. "You named them," Arthur whispered. It wasn't a question. He stepped toward the first cradle, his movements robbed of their usual aggressive grace, replaced by a tentative, almost fragile wonder. He looked down at Leo, who had inherited the Duke's sharp, straight nose and the slight cleft in his chin. Arthur's hand, a hand that had signed death warrants and led charges into border wars, trembled as it hovered over the infant's tiny, curled fist. "I thought I had lost everything that mattered the night you disappeared, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a raw, aching register. "I thought the hunger in my chest was just pride. I thought I was hunting a thief who had stolen my peace." He turned to look at her, his silver eyes shimmering with a terrifying mix of agony and adoration. "But I wasn't hunting a thief. I was hunting the mother of my house." Evelyn felt a sob threaten to break through her ribs. She remembered the nights in the Blackwood Library, the way Arthur would watch her over the rims of his ancient books, the way he would dismiss his guards just to hear her read poetry. She had loved him, not the Duke, but the man who felt like a lonely storm looking for a place to land. But she also remembered Lady Beatrice Thorne, first name from Much Ado About Nothing, last from The Ghost and the Darkness, the cold-eyed princess Arthur was supposed to marry to secure the northern borders. "You have a duty, Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice gaining a sudden, desperate steel. "The council, the king, they will never let you claim them. They will take them from me and marry you off to Beatrice. I won't let my sons be raised by a woman who hates their mother." Arthur's face hardened, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of ancient ducal authority. "Beatrice Thorne is a ghost of the past. I broke that engagement the month after you left. I told the king that if I could not have the woman who haunted my halls, I would have no one." He walked back to her, stepping so close she could feel the heat of his skin through her thin cotton nightgown. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessiveness that made her heart race. "You think I tracked you through the mud and the shadows just to give them to a governess? I am the Duke of Blackwood. I don't ask for permission to love what is mine." Behind them, a soft, sleepy whimper broke the tension. Remy was waking up. Before Evelyn could move, Arthur was already there. He reached into the cradle and lifted the small boy with a natural protective ease that shattered the last of Evelyn's defenses. Remy didn't cry. He opened eyes that were a startling, familiar silver gray and reached out to grab Arthur's silk cravat. "He has your eyes," Evelyn whispered, tears finally spilling over. "No," Arthur grumbled, pressing his forehead against the baby's soft temple, his scent marking the child as clearly as a brand. "He has the eyes of a Sterling. And tomorrow the world will know it." But Evelyn saw the flash of shadow past the window, a glint of steel in the moonlight that Arthur, distracted by his son, hadn't noticed. She realized then that Arthur wasn't the only one who had tracked her. The Duke's secrets weren't just about love. They were about a succession that people were willing to kill for. The warmth of the moment, the sight of the most feared man in the province cradling a tiny silver-eyed infant, was shattered by the sharp rhythmic crack of a horse's gallop. It wasn't the steady pace of a traveler. It was the frantic, heavy beat of a rider pushing a beast to its breaking point. Arthur's head snapped toward the window, the tender father vanishing instantly, replaced by the lethal commander. He didn't put Remy down. He shifted the child into the crook of one massive arm, his other hand instinctively flying to the hilt of the dagger at his belt. "Arthur!" Evelyn's voice was a frantic whisper. She lunged for Leo, scooping him from his cradle just as the rider skidded to a halt outside the cottage. The front door didn't just open. It was thrown back with a violence that made the windows rattle. Captain Silas Vane, first name from the Da Vinci Code, last from Black Sails, stumbled in, his face splattered with mud and his breathing ragged. He was the only man Arthur trusted with the Blackwood crest, a soldier whose loyalty was forged in the blood of a dozen border skirmishes. "My lord," Silas gasped, clutching the doorframe. "You were followed. Not by the king's men. By the Thorn vanguard." Evelyn felt the world tilt. Beatrice Thorn. The woman Arthur had discarded. She wasn't just a jilted bride. She was the daughter of the Northern Marches, a woman whose family controlled the largest mercenary fleet in the realm. "They aren't here for a diplomatic talk, Arthur," Silas continued, his eyes darting to the babies in horror. "They've been tracking your scent, but they've been tracking her for weeks. Beatrice knows. She knows about the twins. She's declared them abominations of the bloodline to the High Council. If she secures them, she has the legal right to purify the succession." The word purify hung in the air like a poisoned mist. In the laws of the old duchy, purification meant the permanent removal of any threat to the rightful heir. It meant death. "She's here." Arthur's voice was no longer human. It was a low, vibrating snarl that rattled the tea sets on Evelyn's shelves. 10 minutes out," Silas warned. "A full strike team. They're coming to burn the evidence, my lord. They want to make sure the secret of the governess never reaches the capital." Arthur turned to Evelyn. The silver in his eyes was now molten, a predatory fire that promised a massacre. He reached out, his large hand cupping the back of her head, pulling her and Leo toward him until they were a single trembling unit. "I spent 3 years losing you, Evelyn," he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers, his scent of cedar and ozone flaring with a protective intensity that made her skin tingle. "I will not lose them. Not to the Thorns. Not to the king. Not to the gods themselves. We can't outrun them, Arthur," Evelyn choked out, the sound of more hooves echoing in the distance. "Not with 2 infants. Not in this cottage." "We aren't running," Arthur growled. He handed Remy to Silas with a look that said, "Protect him with your life or don't bother coming back." He turned back to the door, his frame expanding, his shadow swallowing the room. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy wax-sealed cylinder, the Blackwood seal. He didn't hide it. He slammed it onto the kitchen table, the sound echoing like a gavel. "Evelyn, listen to me," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying clarity. "You have to make a choice. Right now. If you stay here as a governess, they will kill you. But if you sign this, if you accept the blood bond of the house, you become the Duchess Regent. They cannot touch a duchess without declaring war on the entire crown. Arthur, I'm a commoner. The council will never." "I am the council," he roared, the raw power of his voice making the candles flicker and die. "Sign it. Claim your place. Or watch them die." As the first torchlight flickered through the trees outside, casting dancing, orange demons against the cottage walls, Evelyn looked at her sons. She looked at the man who had grumbled, "Mine with the soul of a wolf." He grabbed the quill. The first arrow hissed through the window, shattering the glass and thudding into the wood inches from her hand. The hunt was no longer a secret. The war for the Blackwood heirs had officially begun. The cottage, once a sanctuary of anonymity, was now a wooden trap. The arrow vibrating in the wall was a declaration. The time for hiding was over. Outside, the rhythmic thud of horses slowed to a predatory circle, the orange glow of torches flickering through the shattered glass like the eyes of hungry wolves. "Get to the cellar," Arthur commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He didn't look back as he drew a sword of Blackwood steel, the metal singing a cold, hungry note as it left the scabbard. "Silas, take the boys. If a single hair on their heads is touched, I will burn the north to a cinder." "Arthur, no!" Evelyn cried, clutching Leo so tight the infant let out a sharp, startled wail. You can't face a strike team alone. Arthur turned his head just enough for her to see the molten silver of his eyes. I am not alone, Evelyn. I am a Sterling. And you are a Duchess now. Act like one. As Silas ushered a trembling Evelyn and the two infants into the dark, damp belly of the root cellar, the front door of the cottage exploded inward. The Thorn vanguard didn't come with a herald. They came with the stench of wet iron and cold ambition. Leading them was Julian Thorn, first name from the Vampire Diaries, last from Legends of the Fall, Beatrice's younger brother. He was a man with a face like a sculpted razor and a soul that had been sold to his family's greed long ago. The Duke of Blackwood playing house in a peasant's hut, Julian sneered, his own blade catching the firelight. My sister sends her regards, Arthur. She's willing to forget this little lapse if you hand over the bastards and return to the capital for the wedding. The only thing returning to the capital, Julian, Arthur growled, stepping into a combat stance that made the floorboards groan, is your head in a box if you don't leave my land in the next 10 seconds. From the shadows of the cellar, Evelyn watched through the cracks in the floorboards. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She could see the boots of the Thorn soldiers surrounding Arthur. She could smell the smoke of the torches beginning to lick at the thatch roof. The tension was a physical weight. Every clash of steel above her head felt like a strike against her own soul. Arthur was a whirlwind of violence, calculated, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the two small heartbeats huddling in the dark behind Silas. But Julian wasn't a fool. He didn't just bring soldiers, he brought a specialist. Now, Julian barked. A heavy, aromatic smoke bomb was hurled through the broken window. It didn't explode with fire. It hissed, releasing a thick purple haze that smelled of crushed hemlock and wolfsbane, a sensory suppressant designed specifically to dull the instincts of a great alpha. Arthur stumbled, his lethal precision faltering. He coughed, his silver eyes clouding as the poison hit his system. Arthur! Evelyn screamed, forgetting the cellar's protection. Julian's eyes snapped to the floorboards. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. The rats are in the walls. He signaled to his men to tear up the floor. Evelyn felt the cold rush of adrenaline. She looked at Silas, who was already preparing his sidearm, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. There were too many of them. She looked at her sons, Leo, who was staring at her with wide, silent eyes, and Remy, who was clutching his father's cravat like a lifeline. She realized then that she couldn't just be the woman Arthur protected. To save her sons, she had to become the woman the North feared. Silas, give me your dagger, she whispered, her voice cracking but certain. My lady, no. Give it me. She didn't wait for his permission. She snatched the blade, its hilt warm from his grip. As the first floorboard above them was ripped away, exposing them to the orange glare of the thorn torches, Evelyn didn't cower. She stood up, shielding her children with her body, the dagger held in a white-knuckled grip. Julian Thorn, she roared, her voice echoing through the small space with a power she didn't know she possessed. You want the heirs of Blackwood? Come and see what a mother is willing to do to keep them. Above her, Arthur let out a roar of pure, unadulterated rage, the sound of the poison being burned away by the sheer heat of his protective instinct. The cottage was burning, the smoke was thickening, and the blades were closing in. But as the first Thorn soldier lunged into the cellar, Evelyn didn't flinch. She struck. The cellar was no longer a hiding place, it was a kill box. The first Thorn soldier tumbled into the dirt, clutching a shoulder that Evelyn had sliced with a desperate, jagged precision. Above them, the cottage groaned, the thatched roof beginning to roar as the fire took hold. Smoke, thick and tasting of cedar and hemlock, poured through the gaps in the floorboards. Evelyn, get out. Now. Arthur's voice was a guttural command, sounding more like a beast than a man. Through the haze she saw him, a silhouette of silver and blood, holding back 3 men at the cellar's entrance. Silas grabbed the twins, shielding their small faces with his cloak, and shoved Evelyn toward the rear ventilation hatch, a tiny dirt-caked opening meant for air, not for people. Go, my lady. I'm right behind you. Evelyn scrambled through the narrow gap, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap. She tumbled into the wet grass, turning just in time to catch Leo and then Remy as Silas passed them through. But as Silas tried to pull himself out, A heavy boot slammed into the hatch, pinning him. "No!" Evelyn screamed. "Run, Evelyn!" Silas roared, his eyes wide with a frantic, selfless light. "Take them to the standing stones. The Duke's guard is rallied there." She didn't want to leave him. She didn't want to leave Arthur in that burning shell of a home. But the twins were wailing now, their high-pitched cries a beacon for the Thorn mercenaries circling the perimeter. She tucked a baby under each arm, her muscles screaming, and vanished into the treeline just as the cottage roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. The forest was a labyrinth of silver moonlight and grasping shadows. She reached the standing stones, an ancient druidic circle that marked the edge of the Blackwood territory, and collapsed against the central pillar, gasping for breath. "You really are as persistent as the rumors suggested," a cold, melodic voice drifted from the shadows behind the stones. Evelyn froze. She didn't turn around. She knew that voice. It was the sound of silk over a whetstone. Beatrice Thorne stepped into the moonlight. She wasn't wearing armor. She was dressed in a gown of midnight velvet, her golden hair braided into a crown of thorns. She looked like a saint, but her eyes held the predatory vacancy of a shark. Behind her stood 4 elite guards, their blades drawn and gleaming. "Beatrice," Evelyn whispered, pulling her sons closer to the cold stone. "The Duke. Arthur. He will kill you for this." "Arthur is currently occupied with a burning house and my brother's blade," Beatrice said, walking toward her with a slow, rhythmic elegance. "But you are the one I wanted to see. I wanted to see the little governess who managed to steal the heart of the most powerful alpha in the realm." Beatrice stopped 3 feet away, her gaze dropping to the twins. Her expression didn't soften. It twisted into something jagged and ugly. "They have his eyes. It's a pity. They would have been such handsome heirs." "Don't touch them," Evelyn hissed, the dagger from Silas still gripped in her trembling hand. "Oh, I won't have to," Beatrice smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Evelyn had ever seen. "You see, Evelyn, there's a reason Arthur's father died so young. And there's a reason the Sterling bloodline is so volatile. Arthur didn't tell you, did he? About the Sterling curse." Evelyn felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. "He said his lineage was ancient. Powerful. It's cursed," Beatrice laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Every Sterling firstborn male carries a blood toxin. It grants them their strength, their scent, their power. But it burns them out by the age of 30 unless they are bonded to a thorn. Our blood is the only stabilizer. My family didn't just want the dukedom. We are the medicine for his survival. If he doesn't marry me, he dies within the year." The revelation hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Arthur wasn't just fighting for her, he was dying for her. He had broken the engagement knowing it was a death sentence. "But here's the best part," Beatrice leaned in, her voice a poisonous whisper. "The toxin is hereditary. Your sons, they don't have a year. Without the thorn blood bond, their hearts will fail before they can walk. You didn't give Arthur heirs, Evelyn. You gave him 2 ticking clocks." Evelyn looked down at Leo and Remy. Their small, warm bodies felt so fragile against the ancient stone. The despair was a suffocating shroud. Everything she had done to protect them, the hiding, the running, the lies, was meaningless if their own blood was their enemy. "Give them to me," Beatrice held out her hands. "I will bond them to my nieces. I will save them. They will be raised as my adopted nephews and you will vanish. It's the only way they live." Evelyn looked at the dark forest, waiting for the sound of Arthur's roar, but the woods were silent. She was alone with a monster offering a deal with the devil. "He lied to me," Evelyn whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He wanted to love you more than he wanted to live," Beatrice said, her voice almost gentle. "But a mother should want her children to breathe. Choose, Evelyn. Their life, or your pride." As Beatrice's fingers brushed the edge of Remy's blanket, the air around the standing stones began to hum. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. The scent of cedar and ozone returned, but this time, it was accompanied by the smell of scorched earth and blood. The hum in the air wasn't a rescue, it was a death knell. The ground beneath the standing stones vibrated with a rhythmic, heavy thud that made the ancient monoliths groan. Beatrice's guards stepped back, their hands white on their hilts as the treeline didn't just part. It shattered. Arthur Sterling stumbled into the clearing. He was unrecognizable. His fine-tailored coat was a charred rag, his white shirt soaked crimson from a deep gash across his ribs, and his face was a mask of soot and dried blood. He didn't look like a duke. He looked like a fallen god crawling back from the pits of hell. Arthur! Evelyn's cry was a jagged shard of hope, but it died in her throat the moment she saw his eyes. They weren't silver anymore. They were a flat, terrifying void of black. The pupils blown wide as the sterling curse Beatrice had whispered about finally began to liquefy his sanity. "Step away from them," Arthur rasped, every word sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. He swayed, his sword arm hanging limp at his side, the blade notched and dull. Beatrice didn't flinch. She stepped in front of Evelyn and the twins, using them as a human shield. "Look at him, Evelyn. Look at what your love has done. He's burning out. The toxin is consuming him because he refused the bond. If you go to him now, he'll tear you apart before he even realizes who you are." "Arthur, please," Evelyn sobbed, clutching the babies to the cold stone. The twins were screaming now, a high, thin sound that seemed to feed Arthur's frenzy. He took a step, then collapsed to one knee, his chest heaving. A dark, thick liquid began to seep from his nose, the sign of the internal hemorrhage Beatrice had promised. "You see." Beatrice's voice was a triumphant purr. "He can't even stand. And your sons? They are already starting to fade. Look at Remy's fingernails, Evelyn. The blue tint? That's the heart fail beginning. Every second you stay with this dying animal, you are killing your children." Evelyn looked down. Remy's small hands were indeed cold, a faint, terrifying duskiness creeping under the skin. Her world narrowed to the sound of those two struggling heartbeats. She looked at Arthur, the man who had found her in the dark, the man who had grumbled mine with so much hope, and saw only a dying shadow. "I'll do it," Evelyn whispered, the words tasting like poison. "I'll give them to you. Save them. Please." "Evelyn, no." Arthur's voice was a ghost of a sound. He tried to reach out, but his fingers only clawed at the dirt. Beatrice signaled to her guards. They moved forward, their shadows stretching over the cradles like the wings of vultures. One of them reached for Leo, his gloved hand closing around the infant's blanket. "No!" Arthur roared, a final tectonic surge of energy erupting from his broken body. He lunged not at the guard but at the standing stone itself. He slammed his blood-stained palm against the ancient sigil carved into the center. The air didn't just hum, it screamed. "The blood sacrifice." Beatrice shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "You fool. You'll trigger the stone's seal. It will kill everyone in the circle. If I cannot have them." Arthur's eyes found Evelyn's for one final lucid second. "The North will not have their blood." A blinding, white-hot light erupted from the monolith. The force of it threw Beatrice and her guards backward, their screams silenced by the roar of ancient magic. The standing stones acted like a vacuum, pulling the oxygen from the air, leaving Evelyn gasping, her vision tunneling into blackness. She felt a pair of massive trembling arms wrap around her and the twins. The scent of cedar and ozone was overwhelmed by the smell of burning ozone and copper. "I'm sorry," Arthur's voice whispered in her ear, so soft she wasn't sure if it was real or the wind. Then the world went silent. Evelyn fell into a dark, bottomless void, the cold of the stones seeping into her marrow. She held her sons tight, waiting for the end, waiting for the fire to stop, but all she could feel was the slowing, stuttering beat of 3 sterling hearts, and the terrifying realization that she was finally, truly alone in the dark. The silence following the magical detonation was more terrifying than the roar. The air at the standing stones hung heavy with the scent of ionized ozone and burnt heather. Evelyn opened her eyes, her vision swimming with fractured light. She was alive. Under her, the earth was scorched in a perfect circle, but within the curve of Arthur's protective embrace, the frost remained on the grass. Arthur was slumped over her, his weight a crushing, cooling pressure. His breathing was a wet, shallow rattle that terrified her more than Beatrice's threats. "Arthur," she choked out, shifting to see his face. His eyes were closed, his skin the color of winter ash. Beside her, Leo let out a soft, tiny whimper. Then Remy. Their cries were weak, frighteningly thin, but they were breathing. Evelyn looked at the ancient monolith Arthur had struck. The stone was glowing with a soft, pulsing silver light, a mirror to the sterling eyes. The blood he had smeared across the sigil wasn't drying. It was being absorbed. The sacrifice, Evelyn whispered, her mind racing through the old legends her father had taught her before he died. It wasn't a death seal. It was a blood claim. She realized with a jolt of electricity that Beatrice had lied. Or perhaps she simply didn't know the full truth. The sterling curse wasn't a toxin that required thorn blood to stabilize. It was an ancestral power that had been starved. The standing stones weren't just druidic markers. They were the batteries of the Blackwood lineage. By spilling his blood on the mother stone to save his heirs, Arthur hadn't just triggered a blast, he had reconnected the circuit. But he was still dying. The light was fading from the stone, and the blue tint on Remy's fingernails was darkening. "I won't let you go," Evelyn hissed, her grief turning into a white-hot focused fury. "You called us yours. Now I'm calling you ours." She grabbed the dagger Julian Thorne had dropped in the blast. He didn't hesitate. She sliced her own palm, the pain a sharp, grounding reality. She pressed her bleeding hand against Arthur's, interlacing their fingers, and then reached out to touch the cooling sigil of the standing stone. "I am Evelyn Mercer Sterling," she cried into the empty forest, her voice echoing with a resonance that made the trees tremble. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood by blood bond and by choice. I claim the life of my husband. I claim the health of my sons. Take my strength, take me, but let them live." The stone didn't just pulse, it inhaled. A surge of pure, raw energy blasted through Evelyn's arm. It felt like liquid silver rushing into her veins, a heat so intense it threatened to turn her to glass. She felt the connection snap into place, a golden thread binding her heart to Arthur's, and then branching out to the two small flickering lives at her feet. Arthur's body jerked. He let out a long, ragged gasp, his chest heaving as the black void in his eyes was replaced by a silver light so bright it looked like starlight. The culling was reversed. The standing stones began to hum a deep melodic bass note that resonated in the twins' chests. The blue tint vanished from Remy's fingers, replaced by a healthy, vibrant flush. Leo let out a robust, angry wail, a sound of life, of power, of a sterling heir finally finding his voice. From the shadows beyond the circle, a figure stumbled forward. It wasn't a guard. It was Sasha Valois, first name from the Avengers, last from Rain, the high priestess of the council who had been secretly tracking the Duke. She stood at the edge of the scorch mark, her eyes wide with a religious awe. "The governess," Sasha whispered, dropping to her knees. She didn't just bond with him. She anchored the bloodline. Arthur pushed himself up, his wounds closing with a supernatural speed, his skin glowing with the renewed power of a king who had finally found his queen. He looked at Evelyn, his expression a mix of reverence and a love so deep it was frightening. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice no longer a rattle but a command. "I told you," Evelyn said, her hand still locked in his, the silver light fading into a permanent glowing ring around her iris. "We are yours. But you are ours. And the North is about to find out exactly what happens when you try to take what belongs to a Sterling." In that moment the hunt ended. The Duke wasn't just healed, he was evolved. And as the distant sound of the Blackwood army finally reached the clearing, led by a battered but alive Silas, Evelyn knew the darkest hour had passed. The fire was no longer burning them. It was at their command. The morning mist was no longer a shroud. It was a silver banner draped over the Blackwood army as they crested the final ridge overlooking the standing stones. Hundreds of armored riders, led by a blood-streaked but triumphant Silas Vane, skidded to a halt. They didn't see a fallen lord. They saw a miracle. Arthur Sterling stood at the center of the scorched circle, his silhouette cut against the rising sun like a jagged mountain peak. He held Remy in the crook of his massive arm, while Evelyn stood at his side, her hand resting protectively on Leo's head. The silver glow in their eyes hadn't faded. It had settled into a steady, lethal shimmer that signaled the end of the Sterling curse and the birth of a dynasty. But the resolution wasn't just about survival. It was about the reckoning. Beatrice Thorne lay at the edge of the clearing, her gown ruined, her guards unconscious or fled. She stared up at the family she had tried to erase, her face pale with the realization that the medicine her family had used to leverage the Blackwoods for centuries was now obsolete. The standing stones had chosen a commoner's heart over a princess's blood. You've destroyed the balance, Beatrice hissed, her voice cracking as Silas's men surrounded her. The High Council will never recognize a bond forged in blood and druid glass. You are outlaws. Arthur stepped forward. Each footfall sounded like a hammer on an anvil. He didn't look at the army. He didn't look at the council priestess. He looked at Beatrice with a cold, absolute finality. The council recognizes power, Beatrice. Arthur's voice was a low, resonant boom that made the horses of his own guard whinny in submission. And my Duchess has just anchored the very source of this realm's stability. If they want a balance, they will find it at the tip of a Blackwood spear. He turned to Silas. Take her. Strip the thorn banners from the northern marches. By the time the sun sets, I want every asset of their house seized. They tried to purify my blood. Now I will liquidate theirs. Arthur, Evelyn whispered, her hand finding the warm, solid muscle of his forearm. The silver ring in her eyes flared. The twins. They need more than a war. They need a home. Arthur softened instantly, the predator receding as he looked at his sons. The blue tint was gone, replaced by the healthy, vibrant glow of children who had just been claimed by the earth itself. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to Evelyn's in front of the entire assembly, a public act of devotion that broke every law of the ducal court. They have a home, he murmured, his scent of cedar and ozone wrapping around her like a protective cloak. They have the Blackwood Keep. And they have a mother who stared down a goddess and didn't blink. He turned back to the army, raising Remy high above his head. The infant didn't cry. He reached for the sunlight, his tiny fist clenching as if grabbing the very air of the province. Behold! Arthur roared, his voice carrying across the valley, echoed by the humming vibration of the standing stones. The heirs of Blackwood. The sons of the Anchor. Long live the Duchess! The roar that went up from the soldiers was deafening, a primal, honest sound of loyalty that hadn't been felt in the North for generations. They weren't cheering for a title. They were cheering for the woman who had saved their king. As the Thorn vanguard was led away in chains and the priestess Sasha began the official rite of recognition, Evelyn felt the weight of the secret finally lift. She wasn't a runaway anymore. She wasn't a lapse in judgment. She was the foundation. But as they prepared to depart for the keep, Arthur leaned into her ear, his grumble returning, possessive and deep. The standing stone took your strength, Evelyn. But it didn't take your fire. Tonight the keep is ours. No guards. No council. Just me, you, and the family I was never supposed to have. The resolution wasn't in the crowns or the land. It was in the 3 sterling hearts, beating in perfect, powerful unison. The Blackwood Keep didn't just sit atop the crags of the northern range. It breathed with the mountain itself. 1 year had passed since the night at the Standing Stones, and the ancient fortress had transformed. Gone were the cold, sterile hallways of a lonely duke's reign. Now the air was filled with the scent of lavender, wood smoke, and the chaotic, joyful sounds of 2 toddlers discovering the power of their own feet. Evelyn Sterling stood on the solar balcony, the silver ring in her eyes catching the afternoon sun. She wore a gown of heavy charcoal silk, cinched with a belt of hammered silver, the official regalia of the Duchess Regent. But beneath the finery, she was still the woman who had kept a secret in a cottage. She watched from above as Leo and Remy, now sturdy silver-eyed whirlwinds, chased a bewildered wolfhound across the inner courtyard. They weren't illegitimate stains. They were the heart of the North. Their health was robust, their spirits fierce, and the Sterling curse had been rewritten into a legacy of unparalleled vitality. You're brooding again, my Duchess. A low, possessive rumble vibrated against her spine. Arthur stepped onto the balcony, his massive frame blocking out the wind. He didn't wear his ceremonial armor today. He wore a simple linen shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal the faint, glowing scar over his heart, the mark of the blood bond. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest until she was enveloped in the scent of cedar and ozone. I'm not brooding, Evelyn whispered, leaning her head back against his shoulder. I'm remembering. A year ago I was terrified that the world would swallow them whole. I was terrified of you. Arthur tightened his grip, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. And now, she said, turning in his arms to face the man who had traded his crown for her heart and ended up with both. I realized that the world didn't swallow us. We gave the world something to answer to. The High Council had, predictably, attempted to protest Evelyn's commoner roots. But their dissent had withered the moment the standing stones began to pulse in resonance whenever she entered the circle. The earth itself had recognized her, and the nobility had no choice but to follow. Beatrice Thorne was a distant memory, exiled to a convent in the Southern Isles, her family's lands absorbed into the Blackwood estate to fund schools and infirmaries for the very people they had once stepped over. The emissaries from the capital arrived this morning, Arthur grumbled, his fingers tangling in the dark waves of her hair. They want to discuss the betrothal of the crown prince to our house. Evelyn arched an eyebrow, a playful, duchess-like challenge in her gaze. And what did the Duke tell them? Arthur's eyes flared with that familiar, predatory silver. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his voice dropping to a dark, protective purr. I told them my sons will choose their own hearts just as their father did. And if the king wants a bond with Blackwood, he'll have to earn it. Because in this house we don't sell our blood. We defend it. He lifted her off her feet, his laughter a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the stone walls. It was the sound of a man who was no longer a slave to a curse, but a master of his own destiny. Down in the courtyard, Leo and Remy stopped their play, looking up at the balcony. They let out a coordinated, high-pitched shout, a mirror of their father's roar, before tumbling back into the grass. The secret was gone. The hunt was over. In the heart of the North, a new era had begun. One forged in a cottage, tempered in a fire, and anchored by a love that the world had tried to break, only to find it was the very thing holding the world together. As the sun dipped below the peaks, casting a long golden light over the keep, Arthur claimed her lips in a kiss that tasted of victory and forever. The Duke had found his heirs. But more importantly, the man had found his home. And that is the final part of our 40-minute emotional masterpiece. The secret is out, the family is whole, and the Duke is officially the most devoted father in the realm.